You see, whatever is conceded to this fringe left-wing element is never enough. Kevin Rudd did the apology. That was supposed to be it. But it's never enough. Just look at your screens here. Now, have a look at that. Well, this is the number of registered corporations by regions. You can see it there in Australia as at June 30, 2021. 3,352 registered Aboriginal corporations. Now, as well, the Prime Minister has an Indigenous Advisory Council. There are more than 30 land councils. And you can see there 3,352 Aboriginal corporations. There's a so-called Council of Peaks, which represents 70 Aboriginal organisations. The Aboriginal population of Australia is officially 3.8%. We have 11 Aboriginal MPs in the federal parliament, which represents 4.8% of the parliament. But now they want an Aboriginal voice. I'll come to that in later programs. I went to a funeral some weeks ago of a very dear friend, my first doctor in Sydney, a distinguished man who was variously a chemical engineer with first-class academic qualifications from Sydney University. He then became a doctor, and he was outstanding, a gentle soul to whom there were no good or bad people. All people were treated equally by him. Chemical engineer, then a doctor. But then the drug scourge was overtaking young people. They'd come to his surgery and tell their story. He learnt that there were people out there who had no one to defend them and no means of defending themselves. So he told me he'd go back to uni to get a law degree. So he did. So he practiced medicine from Monday to Wednesday, midday, put the wig on and defended these poor coots on Thursday and Friday. He sold up his lucrative practice and his assets in Sydney, telling me he had one other vocation to pursue. He wanted to be a successful farmer. He opened a medical practice in Yass. His daughters, brilliant daughters, also doctors, assisted him. The family was full of really bright people. He bought a farm not far from Yass, and that too became a remarkable success. Well, he died. The funeral was at Yass. He wanted to be buried on the farm. It was a very hot day. The grave had been dug. We all headed out there. A very kindly priest had presided at the church. He knew Doc well. But before the coffin was being lowered, or as it was being lowered into the grave on the farm, the priest gently reminded us that we should remember who the real owners of this land are, and mentioned some tribe that most had never heard of. I shook my head and said to one of his daughters beside me, Doc worked his backside off night and day to own this land, and here we are about to lower him into the grave, and we're being told he isn't the real owner. Now, this nonsense has got to stop, because remember, it's now being said by some that because we aren't the owners, we're going to have to pay rent to whomever the real owners are. Someone's got to stand up to this nonsense. As the historian Keith Windschuttle said, quote, 2 decades ago, this ritual was unknown. That is, welcome to country. He said, quote, it was introduced without public debate, let alone public support, and its authors have never been named or their purposes justified, unquote. But, says historian Keith Windschuttle, since the passing of the Native Title Act in 1993, quote, this has been foisted on a mystified public as though it had the sanction of deep Indigenous tradition, unquote. But this stuff, as you know, is commonplace in schools, universities, boardrooms, sport and the arts. You can't escape it. This is what young Australians are being taught, browbeaten to the point of intimidation, which prevents them from challenging the notion of invasion or challenging the notion that they must accept that another people unknown to them own the land that they live on, that are being educated on, that are performing on, or even being buried on. This stuff is following Australians to the grave. Well, some Indigenous academics might regard 1788 as a year of invasion and that unknown Indigenous Australians own this land. They are a minority, but they're entitled to that view. But they are not entitled to browbeat other Australians into agreeing or to argue via welcome to country that the land we live on isn't actually ours, that we should be grateful that the traditional owners allow us to generate a wealth and a lifestyle from which all Australians benefit, including Indigenous Australians.